Now, the successful deployment of 5G, of course, requires robust network infrastructure. And the government is considered to be the most critical catalyst in this whole ecosystem. But to shed more light on how the Indian government is rallying to make 5G a reality, we felt that nobody would be more appropriate than Madam Secretary herself. So another huge round of applause for Aruna Sundararajan. Ma'am, if you could please approach the dais and address our gathering.
The editor, Shri T.K. Arun, and the entire editorial team of ET Telecom, all the leaders of the 5G industry, and I see a lot of them here in the audience, the larger stakeholder community representatives from the telecom industry, the telecom department, distinguished friends from the media. At the outset, let me compliment the ET team for organizing such an excellent platform. And I was just remarking to Arun that normally it's only in political functions that you get such a large turnout. But clearly, I think 5G is exciting everybody. And I think the main reason is, as all of you know by now, 5G is not yet another G. It actually signals a much larger shift, a paradigm shift. And the promise that 5G holds is that the fabric of connectivity that we have today is set to expand 10 times. In fact, speeds, they say, will increase 10 times to 100 times. But if we look at the entire world being enveloped by a fabric of high speed, high data throughput capability, I think that is what 5G actually offers. And that is why, rightly, I think, not just industry, but almost every user industry is also equally excited. In India, you have heard the minister mention time and again that while we may have missed earlier 3G, 2G, 4G buses, that as far as 5G is concerned, India will embrace this technology at the earliest, and that the government on its part will leave no stone unturned to ensure that the requisite infrastructure for this is put in place, that the enabling environment in terms of policies and regulation will be put in place, and that the ease of doing business, which is also a key part of this, will be tweaked to ensure that we are able to get all the global majors in this area to start working with Indian industry and the Indian telecom service providers. As we all know, in India, in fact, somebody was asking the other day, what is it that 5G will mean for ordinary Indians, and is it really going to make a difference for ordinary Indians? And I think that is the challenge that government is trying to address. Because many of the use cases that we see today globally may not be the most high priority use cases that we will probably have in India. In India, both the government as well as the high-level task force on 5G, which, as you know, is chaired by a very eminent Indian, Professor Paul Raj, and has all the IITs and the triple ITs, as well as the Indian Institute of Science, all the thought leaders in this area, along with the industry stakeholders, are already represented on the committee. And the idea is that India must move on all three fronts at the same pace. One, to ensure that there is early deployment, but also to ensure that there is impactful and meaningful deployment. What we mean by this is that autonomous cars or vehicles may not be the most high priority usage for India. But there will be several other areas where 5G will make a lot of sense for India. We will have to identify and work with industry to see where is it that this is going to be most impactful. So first of all, for India, 5G has to be impactful. Secondly, it cannot leave out rural India. Although we all recognize that for reasons of monetization, we may not have every part of India getting onto the 5G bandwagon at the same time. However, it will be government's endeavor to ensure that if we want to ensure deployment of 5G in sectors like agriculture, remote medicine, etc., where there is probably the most impact, then the policies that would be required to make that happen would be put in place by the government. So the first one is meaningful, impactful, pervasive deployment of 5G and how that can happen. The second is to ensure that the Indian ecosystem develops concurrently with the deployments. And this will mean standards adapted to India. This will mean that IPR, research and development, startups, whether it is in the field of IoT or in the field of healthcare or in the field of digital agriculture, that all these startups have an environment in which they can start working on the 5G technologies. So that is the second strand of activity which the government will actively work towards promoting. And thirdly, that manufacturing in India for 5G also happens. The initial part of the roadmap, a fairly detailed one as far as deployment, standards, spectrum availability, all these, we have already got a detailed roadmap from the 5G task force. We are in the process of actioning many of them. I'll detail some of the actions that we are in the process of taking. In addition to the roadmap, as all of you know, the government as early as March last year had already announced in the budget that there will be a certain sum of money up to 500 crores which will be given for developing the first test bed in India. The IIT Chennai as well as a host of other IITs is already working on establishing the test bed. We know that some of the global OEMs have already established their test beds and centers of excellence. Ericsson has already done so in Delhi. We expect that Nokia, Samsung, all of them are in various stages of setting up the test beds. The Indian government has already written to the global majors to participate in early trials. I'm thankful to them, to the companies, for the outstandingly positive response that we have received. We intend to write to all the OEMs in the coming days to invite them to partner with us. We are also in an advanced stage of seeing how we can make spectrum available, the requisite bands of spectrum available for free experimentation. We have already taken a decision that the requisite spectrum bands for early trials test beds, etc., will be made available to the players. And we've also received some specific suggestions, which I will just share with you in a moment. We have also started working with some very promising startups. You know that in this area, the IIT Hyderabad, but also IIT Chennai, plus a few companies like Sankhya Labs, Bangalore, etc., have already started working in this area. And of course, if we look at the startups in the IoT and other areas of digitally enabled healthcare, etc., there is a much larger number of startups. So the DOT is putting in place a special window and platform for us to bring these startups on board the trials and the test beds, so that together, over a period of time, we can have assured access to a set of capabilities in this area. We do believe that 5G is going to be a major catalyst for Digital India. And that is why in the early use cases, we've already identified some of the key domains. And I was delighted to see that in the presentation made on Ericsson, there has been some indication of the kind of potential monetization that this has for the telecom operators. And we know that the telecom operators at the moment are looking at all avenues for greater monetization. And therefore, I think the pointers that were given by Ericsson would be very, very good news indeed. And whenever people ask, when is India going to be ready for 5G? I think the answer would be that the technology is already here. It is really a question of the monetization roadmap that people have for this. But what we in India are seeking to do is to marry the monetization possibilities with impact. And that is where I think we will have to evolve our own roadmap. And we look forward to working with all segments of industry. So whether it is the financial sector, or whether it is the manufacturing sector, Industry 4.0, whether it's the healthcare sector, whether it is smart cities, I think in all these areas, over the coming 6 months to a year, we will be making very sincere efforts to get all the industry partners on board. We've already had some discussions with NITI on this to see how we can mobilize the larger industry bodies, because unless they get onto this and start looking at how specific use cases can evolve, what will happen is that the technology will be available, but the actual rollouts will not happen. In terms of the actual suggestions that have been given by the task force for wireless access, they have recommended the licensed spectrum, an aggregate of about 542 megahertz has been identified below 4 gigahertz and 13.55 gigahertz below 45 gigahertz. We have already received the TRI recommendations on 3.3 to 3.6. They have identified a fairly large chunk of bandwidth. We know in India that one of the frequent complaints of industry or constraints that industry faces is the lack of adequate spectrum, and I was given to understand that even this morning reference was made to the need for much larger spectrum to be made available for carriers. And I think the TRI recommendations in this regard should be welcomed by all, because they have identified over 300 megahertz to be made available for 5G. We have set up a committee which is already looking into this. For 24 to 29.5, we invite companies to come for rollout and to start large-scale trials. For backhaul, the task force has identified 14 gigahertz of unlicensed and 10 gigahertz of lightly licensed spectrum. We will be shortly forwarding these to TRAI for formal recommendations. And for Wi-Fi, we have already taken the decision to open additional bands of unlicensed spectrum for outdoor use. On the regulatory policy, we all know that while 5G will provide wireless umbrella coverage, we do need huge fiberization to happen for backhaul to be available. And we have already said in the policy that we need to go up to 60% fiberization as the immediate goal before 2022. So we are working with the states to ensure that the rights of way policies in this area, which are to some extent a constraint, can be addressed. We have said that one of the first actions we will embark on is the fiber first implementation once the policy is launched. And we are also in talks with TAIPA as well as the tower companies to see how this fiberization can happen faster. On applications, I've already mentioned to you that before the end of this year, we hope to be able to demonstrate actual use cases that have relevance for India. And based on those, we hope that over the course of the next year, we will be able to bring large sectors on board rather than merely speaking about 5G being full of potential and promise. We have already, I think, some capabilities which have been demonstrated. The standards body has also been doing good work. We have had some wins globally with Indian standards being accepted there. This work needs to be intensified as we go along. And I think that basically we recognize that 5G is going to be a core technology for India, especially given India's aspirations to be a global digital leader. We know that we will have to work on a number of areas. So whether it is the skill sets, ensuring that deep R&D happens in some of these core technologies, but also providing the necessary finance to some of these early startups to ensure that they are able to cater not just to an Indian market, but to a global market. So I think the government of India recognizes the seminal importance and criticality of both digital communications for India's growth, but also 5G. And I'm sure that these kind of seminars will be a valuable input and exercise in getting the stakeholders together, because 5G will not happen just by fiat alone or by saying that India is going to be a leader in 5G. Hard, sustained work will have to be done by each of the stakeholders, and therefore we look forward to a period of active engagement with all the stakeholders to make sure that India does indeed leverage the potential of 5G for inclusive growth in the country, but also for expanding the entire digital ecosystem, and through that making next generation services available to the people. So once again, let me thank ET for hosting this, and thank you for giving me this privilege of interacting with you this morning.